On today's podcast, we have the great Don Passman. Don is returning to the show. If you guys recall, he was our guest. He was our very first guest last year, back in March. We had him back on the show to talk about all you need to know about the music business, the 11th edition, the brand new edition that he just finished and released. He talks about AI. He talks about streaming. He talks about the MMA. He also talks about the true value of music publishing and all of these deals that have been done, and a lot of other great information that you're not going to want to miss. This is one episode you definitely want to hear. Insiders, are you ready?
Welcome to MUBUTV's Music Business Insider Podcast, where our mission is to educate, empower, and engage artists and music business professionals who are dedicated to having a successful career in the new music industry. Here are your hosts, Ritch, Esra, and Eric Knight. Welcome back, Insiders, to another episode of the MUBUTV Music Business Insider Podcast, where our mission is to educate, empower, and engage your music career. On today's episode, we're back with the man who literally wrote the book, All You Need to Know About the Music Business. I, of course, refer to Don Passman, who returns to the show to discuss his brand new edition of the book, which is in its 11th incarnation. He discusses AI, streaming, the true value of music publishing, and why artists today have more power than in any other time in history. But first, a word from our sponsor. Hey, Insiders, are you looking to take your music career to the next level? Then you need to know about the Music Business Registry. The Music Business Registry is the leading music industry publisher of the most up-to-date contact information for major and independent record label A&R, music publishers, artist managers, music attorneys, music supervisors, and much, much more. The Music Business Registry is the trusted industry standard and source, serving the music business community for over 28 years with the most accurate and up-to-date contact information available. Their titles include the A&R Registry, the Film and Television Music Monthly, the Music Publisher Registry, and the Music Attorney Registry. All of their publications are available in print, PDF, CSV, or online subscription. Visit them now at musicregistry.com and receive a 10% discount by using coupon code MUBUTV10 at checkout. That's musicregistry.com, coupon code MUBUTV10. When you're ready to put your music to work, musicregistry.com.
Welcome back, Insiders. Today, we have a very special guest returning to the show. I, of course, refer to the one and only Don Passman. We had a chance to catch up with him to discuss the 11th edition of his incredible book, which is considered the Bible, All You Need to Know About the Music Business. This was a great discussion, Eric. I thought, some of the main things that he talked about, which I thought was most interesting, was at the beginning of the conversation when you asked him about the length of time. The last edition he had told us when we talked to him before took him 4 years. He said it was the longest amount of time that he had ever spent. Ironically, he said this one didn't take as long, but it took him 3.5, which was that's really a significant amount of time, considering that this is just an update.
Right.
To the previous edition, which was the longest.
And that was one question that I had that we didn't get to ask him, and I should have, and now I regretted it, was I wanted to ask him how he figures out what is the content that he's going to include in the book, and how does he do that? Is that like a running list that he's keeping, in terms of what subjects he's going to cover in the book? You mean
the new things that
he wants to cover. So that was something that I thought I wanted to ask him. But yeah, it was a great conversation. One of the things that you and I talked about even before we did the interview was talking about AI and the importance and the idea that you don't get a copyright from what you're creating on AI. And I thought that was very interesting to hear what he had to say about that.
Absolutely. The most interesting part about the AI discussion, which he says is the most profound change in the new book, when he talks about that, the most interesting part in the conversation when you asked him about that I thought was when he spoke about the fact that the AI element came up literally in the middle of his revising for the 11th edition. It wasn't something that was like a fait accompli.
It just
and now he's going to write.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's what was interesting, and all the points that you brought up. I mean, essentially, we are in the wild, wild west. We're in a new frontier. We're facing something that not only is going to affect music,
right,
but it's going to affect the entire culture,
the industry,
all of the industry,
jobs, everything,
and it's going to affect far more than just entertainment or far more than just media. And he made that clear that, there's far more implications. I thought the other element that was most fascinating was his explanation and understanding of the streaming model. Most people don't seem to have a real solid understanding of that. The way he explained how,
they calculate how many streams come in and how is that paid out depending on how much your song has streamed and versus somebody else's. And
exactly. And what percentage of that is yours? Meaning you may have a giant hit that's massive, like, The Weeknd or Ariana Grande or whatever. And that means that, everybody else within the system is going to be getting
a smaller portion.
Portion that you're getting a specific amount, as opposed to the old model, which was record royalties. You sold 10 million albums, you received royalties on 10 million albums.
Right.
If Streisand sold 10 million albums, she received royalties on 10 million albums. They didn't affect each other. Whereas the ecosystem that we are in today is very, very symbiotic, where where what you make affects what I make within that system. That's something totally new.
So with that, insiders, sit back. We're very excited to share this new episode with you with the great Don Passman.
Don, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ritch.
Don, first of all, congratulations on the publication of the 11th edition of All You Need to Know About the Music Business. One of the main statements at the beginning in your intro that really struck me is that you say, today, artists have more power than at any other time in history. Can you tell us why this is?
Absolutely. The way that the music business has evolved is that record companies now all have data geeks watching to see who's starting to pick up traction online. And when they see someone who's starting to get social engagement, starting to get a lot of plays and a lot of listens to their music, they pounce on them because they realize there's some predictable future there, and therefore they're taking much less risk in signing that kind of person. However, all of the record companies have essentially the same data. So that means they're all pouncing at the same time. And as you know, when you are the fox and a lot of hounds are chasing you, you're going to have a fair amount of leverage. So the artists now have power to get deals that they could have never gotten before in history as a first deal. For example, they may keep ownership of their recordings and merely license it to the record company, or they may share in the profits instead of getting a royalty.
Don, this is Eric, and thank you so much for joining us again. We're really, really happy to have you back, and congratulations on the new edition. When we last spoke, you mentioned that your last edition took 4 years to complete, the longest ever. How long did the 11th edition take?
It took a little less than that. It was about 3.5 years, but that's also because I started a little late, to be perfectly honest. It was not as extensive as the prior edition because in the prior edition, streaming completely changed the ecosystem of the record business, which I would be happy to explain if you'd like as to why and how.
Absolutely.
And so this edition was not nearly as radical, but there was still a whole lot of new information and a lot of things going on, such as the one that we just talked about, of why artists have so much power in this environment, and the new things also about the multi-hundred, sometimes plus $1 million sales of catalogs. So let me talk about why streaming completely upended the record business. So historically, music was monetized by selling something. That, in the beginning, could have been a piano roll, or it could have been a wax cylinder, and of course later it was obviously, vinyl and cassettes and CDs. But it was always selling something. And what that means is that when somebody bought a record, the artist gets X amount of dollars, and it doesn't matter whether that person plays the record 1,000 times or never takes it out of the shrink wrap. The artist and the record company both get paid the same amount of money. In a streaming system, that's not true. Today, the way that money gets divvied up is based directly on the number of streams that you had compared to the number of streams that everybody else has. So if you had 10% of the streams in a month on Spotify, just to pick an example, then you would get 10% of the money that Spotify collects that month, or at least a percentage of what they pay over to the record label, and then the artist gets a percentage of that from the label. Now, that sounds less upending than I just made it sound, but let me point out the following. Because of the fact that it's a ratio, it means that the number of plays that I get in a month directly affects how much money you get in a month. In other words, in the record physical days, it didn't matter how many records I sold because my fans were going to buy my records and your fans were going to buy your records. In other words, if anything, having a big hit, if you had one, it might mean that my fans go to the store and are more likely to buy my record while they're there. In today's world, the more spins and the more listens that I get, the less money you make because I've now got a bigger piece of the pie. In other words, it's a finite pool of money, and that's never existed in the past. So there's going to be X dollars collected every month from subscription and advertising money by the digital service providers. And then that's after they take their cut is what gets divvied up and paid out to the record labels, and then what goes to the labels gets divvied up and paid to the artist, all based on the ratio of the number of plays that I have versus you.
Okay.
Don, you've literally been on the front lines of some of the most profound changes in this business for the last 40 years. And I'm curious, what surprised you the most about the new changes that you address in the 11th edition?
I think it was the artificial intelligence, which I have a section on. I wasn't expecting that. It actually came up while I was, doing research for the book because it's relatively recently. It just appeared out of nowhere. And it is a fairly surprising change because nobody's quite set up to deal with it. In other words, the existing laws have to be looked at pretty carefully to see how it works and who can do what to whom. And when you have that situation, predictably, we have litigation going on and people suing each other about artificial intelligence, way beyond the music business, but certainly significant things are going on here. And if you want me to talk a little bit about AI, I'd be happy to.
Yes, most definitely.
Okay. The first thing you need to know about artificial intelligence is that you can't get a copyright in it. And a copyright means, which again I explain in All You Need to Know About the Music Business, is that when you create something, you have the exclusive right to use it with a few exceptions. And nobody else can do it unless they get your permission and allow you to do it. So in other words, if I go write a song and I own it, you want to record it, you have to come to me for a license. Or you want to put it in a movie, you have to come to me for a license. So I control it. Now, if AI creates something, in other words, if I tell the machine, go write me a lullaby, and it writes a lullaby, nobody has a copyright in that because it has to be created by a human in order to be copyrightable. And so we've got the situation where if you create it, the AI creates it, then nobody can owns it and nobody can get paid for it. And so we're into this sort of interesting land of what happens and whether there's a way to, to put it into the machine with enough creativity, human creativity, that maybe you could get some kind of copyright in it. But so far this is very unclear and the law is unclear. And I'm sure you've already seen instances where someone did a fake Drake in The Weeknd AI that sounded like them. And there was a fair amount of flap about that. And artists have legitimate concerns that they don't want their voice associated with material they didn't create. And of course, if it's AI, nobody's getting paid for it. So that's another issue about whether that's going to happen. So the potential for this to be disruptive is huge, but so far we haven't seen but just the tip of it.
Do you think that that's going to eventually change, Don, and evolve where the laws will change, where AI will become possibly copyrightable for people that, do something like maybe run a prompt through ChatGPT, for instance, and that would be something that they would eventually own? Do you see that evolving into that, or?
I think that's unlikely. And even if they did, then the question is, who would own the copyright?
Right.
Would it be the people who created ChatGPT?
Exactly.
Would it be the person who did the input? Would it be somebody whose material was used to train the AI?
Right.
These are all questions that would have to get sorted. And I don't know if I create something that I'd like the answer that ChatGPT may own it. That doesn't seem like I'd be too happy.
Right. Don, I wanted to ask you, one of the things you point out in an indirect way in your book is that streaming creates a war between the value of paid subscription versus popular reach. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts on this issue and how do you see this playing out?
Well, I think that If you're talking about the things like, the free services or the ad-supported services?
Correct.
As opposed to subscription? Yeah. I mean, I think that people would like it much better if people paid a subscription fee, because it generates far more money than advertiser-supported streaming does. So I think the tendency is to want to push toward that. The streamers that offer advertising supported, though, take the position that it helps people get into the system, and maybe they switch over to subscription. Although I don't have the statistics, but I'm not completely convinced yes, I'm sure there's some of it, but not necessarily a huge amount of that some people just never want to pay. And then if you're talking about things like YouTube, the advertiser supporting is obviously the main part of it. And a lot of people do see that as promotional. In other words, that getting your video out there will help get you streams on the paid subscription services. And of course, YouTube has a subscription service as well.
Right. Don, I wanted to ask you, can you speak about the Music Modernization Act and its impact on royalties? Because that was a very big element over the last, 5 years that's come about in relation to music and to restructuring our whole way of thinking about the modern business today.
Sure. The Music Modernization Act I covered in the last edition as well, and although of course it's covered here also. But which particular aspect of it were you thinking about?
Specifically on the royalties aspect, on how it pays royalties and what royalties are covered. I mean, there was a lot of clarification on, the streaming aspect, I believe, in terms of how things were paid.
Yes, there was. It was less about figuring out how much got paid, because that was handled separately by the Copyright Royalty Board, than it was about finding and creating a system where it was much easier to get paid through something called the Mechanical License, the MLC, Mechanical Licensing Council. I may have the name wrong. So what happened was the following, that the digital service providers were unable to figure out who owned all of the songs that they were playing. It was easy enough if they went to the major publishers to get licenses and then just pay the major publishers. But the problem was that there were a number of songs where they didn't know who owned them. They couldn't find them, and they didn't have the resources to track down obscure publishers that might have 5% of a song. So they ended up getting sued by these obscure publishers because they did not have a license. And at the same time, the record labels were frustrated because the digital service providers now had a pot of money. They weren't paying anybody because they couldn't find the owners. So they were sitting there with this money and not paying anyone. The publishers wanted to get paid. Meanwhile, the digital service providers were getting sued by these people that they didn't have licenses from. And we had this moment where everybody suddenly realized there needs to be a better system. So what the Music Modernization Act did was create a system to set up this MLC. And the MLC is paid for by the digital service providers, all the costs of it. And what's interesting about that is it means 100% of the money that goes into it for the licenses gets paid to the publishers. Normally, a collection society will take a percentage before they pay it over and not pay 100%, but the MLC, they pay 100%. And so now we have a system so that the digital service providers only have to pay the money to one place. Now, this does not cover the major publishers who have their own direct licenses with the MLC. This covers everybody else. But or sometimes the major publishers may use it as well because it doesn't cost anything. But we now have the system where it's paid through there, and it works for everybody because the publishers get it without any charge for collection, and the digital service providers are no longer liable for copyright infringement as long as they pay the money over.
Let me ask you, Don, one of the lines in your new edition that really grabbed my attention was where you were writing about streaming, and you say, the more listens you get, the less money I make. A truly radical change. Would you expand on this a bit?
Sure. It's what we talked about earlier, that the way the money gets divided works like this. We take the total number of plays that I had during the month for a particular service, call it Apple Music, and then we look at the total number of plays that everybody had that month at Apple Music. So just to make numbers easy, let's say there was 1 million streams. There's obviously way more than that. And that I had 100,000. So that means 10% of the streams that month were mine, and 10% of the money that Apple Music pays out, which is not 100% because they obviously have to be in business and keep a profit, but they'll pay out a chunk of that. And that money, 10% of that money is allocated to me, or my record company specifically. Then my record company gets it, and they look at what percent of streams that their company had that month, all of their artists versus everybody else, and whatever percentage that is, I get. So there's two stages to it. One is you look at the number of streams the record company had that month for its artists versus all the other record companies. That percentage, again, it gets paid out. I oversimplified in the first example, but that percentage is paid to the record label. And then whatever that dollar amount is, they allocate it between the artists on their label based on the number of plays that each artist had. So again, if I had 10% of the play on that record label's artist for Apple Music that month, I would get 10% of that money allocated to me. Then they take whatever royalty deal I have based on that money, and they give me my percentage of that.
Hey, Insiders, we hope that you've been enjoying our featured interview. Stay tuned because we've got so much more value coming your way. But before we dive back in, a word from our sponsor. So, hey, Ritch, tell me a little bit about the Music Business Registry.
Well, what we are, Music Business Registry is the leading contact directory. We publish all of the most current, accurate, and up-to-date contact information for the music industry. We do directories for A&R. We do directories for music publishers. We do directories for film and television music. We do directories of artist managers, and we do directories of music attorneys. And we also sell other publications too, like the Indie Bible Series, the YouTube Bible Series, the Indie Spotify Bible Series, and other things as well. That's what we're about.
So if I wanted to find out, let's say, the music supervisor for American Horror Story, I can kind of go into the Film and TV monthly and find the information that I need there?
Well, we don't list specific shows. If you know who the music supervisor is, and you can find that out on IMDb, then you can find their contact information. And we have that in our Film and Television Music Monthly. Absolutely, yes.
That's great. And I hear that we have a discount right now. If you go to musicregistry.com and use coupon code MUBUTV10 at checkout, you'll receive 10% off your first order.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah, we offer that to all of the MUBUTV insiders.
So insiders, check out musicregistry.com and use MUBUTV10 as your coupon code.
Okay, that makes sense. I wasn't aware, and I guess most people weren't aware that it's a finite pool. It's, it's almost like we're used to thinking, everybody who streams a lot of music or has massive songs makes that money, which is kind of the model you were talking about. Well, if my record sells a lot and your record sells a lot, we'll still make, we'll make the same amount of money.
Yes, that's correct.
In the old model.
Yeah. Because in the old model, I got a certain amount for every sale, regardless of what anybody else got.
Correct.
Here, you don't get a certain amount for every stream. It gets divided up. It's X dollars, which is the finite pool, and then it's divided based on how many streams that I had versus how many streams everybody else had. So the more streams that you get, the less money I'm going to get because now my percentage is smaller. In other words, if you had 0 streams and I had all of them, I'd get 100%. But as soon as you get 25% of the streams, I'm down to 75%.
Earlier in our conversation just now, you mentioned that in the new edition of the book, that one of the most, dramatic elements was the introduction of AI. And I'm curious, do you see AI becoming more disruptive for creators and writers, songwriters and artists alike? Or do you see it rectifying itself through legal and established kind of standards that are coming about?
I think I see some of each. First of all, I think AI can be an incredibly useful tool. I think artists can use it in their creativity in a way that I think is meaningful. I don't see a world where we no longer have poetry or motion pictures or songs, that everything's created by AI. I don't think that happens. I suppose it could. But I do think, and by the way, AI has implications way beyond music.
Oh, yeah.
It has the ability to disrupt many, many businesses and put people out of work. And yes, I'm sure the creativity will get better. And I'm sure it will come along with that possibility But I believe in the long run that it's, the human element is going to be what connects to people because it comes from the soul.
Don, since we last spoke, many iconic artists, Dylan, Paul Simon, Neil Young, Stevie Nicks, have all sold all of their ownership in their songs and recording catalogs for like record amounts. You write in your book that you encourage your clients not to sell their catalogs. And I'm curious as to what's your thinking behind this.
Sure. Yeah, I think for most people, it has historically been a mistake that virtually everyone who has sold their catalog has regretted it down the road. Yes, we're getting record prices, and yes, they may not be here at some point in the future. But at the same time, it's a question of who knows? I mean, the income streams are going up, and you've got some very sophisticated financial people on the other side who are betting the other way. So they obviously think they're going to make a profit on it in one form or another. And I give them the example of the Beatles catalog sold to Michael Jackson for $47 million, and today it's arguably worth $1 billion. So, people that sell historically have regretted it. The other thing I do is I say go through this pretty simple exercise. Take the amount of money that you're going to get and pay your taxes, pay your expenses of selling it, which are not necessarily insubstantial. How much have you got left? How are you going to invest it? And can you make the same amount of money your catalog's making? And a lot of times the answer is no. And even if it makes the same amount or close to it, does it have the upside potential of your catalog? Well, nobody knows because that's down the road, but who knows? It could or it couldn't. Of course, it could go the other way. Your income could fall off. But we're usually talking about seasoned catalogs that are pretty reliable and have very similar income for a number of years. Now, on the other hand, there are situations where I think it does make sense. I think older artists who have heirs that either don't know how to use a catalog or how to take care of it when someone's gone, or that will fight each other and cause physical and mental bodily damage if they are involved in fighting about it, then it may make sense to sell it. And it can also make sense from an estate planning point of view, because the catalog left in your estate will be valued and you'll pay an estate tax on it. And if you don't have the cash to do that, you may be forced to sell it at not necessarily the best of circumstances, because this market goes up and down like most others. So I do think there are some situations where it makes sense, but most of the time, as I say, I try to talk people out of it. And having said that, I've still done a number of these sales, and all of my job is to explain. And if people want the check and they want to do it, then that's their decision.
Yeah, you know what's interesting, Don, is there's been a couple managers who have also brought up another factor in relation to what you're saying, which is that, and this was by a manager who had done one of these deals. He said, you also have to be very, very good about money, because you have to realize if you're going to, and in his situation, I think he was getting like somewhere in the neighborhood of $31 million for the deal. For his client. And he was saying, because if you are not, I know it sounds absurd, but how many lottery winners are completely broke within a couple years? It's not unrealistic to think that, I got $30 million, I'm set, and my children are set for the next, 2 lifetimes. It's not always the case. And I'm sure, you've seen many times, and we've all heard the famous stories of, people who have gone through the money ridiculously fast and, in grossly irresponsible ways. And I'm only bringing that up because at least the catalogs provided them with a consistent income year in and year out. And that all goes away, for the reasons that you stated. So that's another consideration in terms of doing this.
No, you're exactly right. And people are going to need to live, particularly if you're someone whose, current state of affairs isn't doing as well as your past state of affairs. You're going to need to live the rest of your life. And if you're not good with money, as you very smartly pointed out, you are going to burn through it. And then when you get to zero, then what?
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
And longevity too. People are living a lot longer too. So, that's another consideration, outliving the money,
Yep. Another good point.
Yeah, and as you brought up, we have seen that, it's playing out right now. The Prince estate is just in the state where they're constantly, and what's ironic about it, as you were speaking about, like people fighting over the estate and whatever, what's ironic about it is that I believe more than, is it 3/4 of that estate or the ownership has been sold already to Primary Wave, but it's the other two elements that are still, that didn't sell, that are still fighting. And it's like, wow. I mean, even in the event where it's, half sold or 3/4 sold, you're still having these kinds of problems. But
yeah, I don't know the specifics on the Prince estate, but I do know that it does have the potential to create some problems.
Yeah, precisely. Don, you've been at the forefront of creating and negotiating artist agreements for a very, very long time now. Today, if you could change one thing in artist agreements, what would it be and why?
I think that, what do you mean by change? I mean, because they're all pretty negotiable and sometimes don't quite look at each other. So
okay. Well, I meant, was there ever, or is there a particular point or a particular aspect of contracts that you are not, fond of? But I guess, as you say, maybe everything is negotiable depending on your power. I just wondered if there was any particular element within agreements that you would like to see more artist-oriented in your dealings with labels or publishers or those kinds of situations. Or maybe it's not even in contracts with labels or publishers. Maybe it's in other kinds of agreements, because I know you do agreements maybe with promoters or with concerts or with companies, etc., whether it's in likeness or I don't know. I just thought I would ask the question because you're on the forefront of so many of these kinds of deals representing artists.
Okay, now I understand. I think that the main thing, and that cuts across all of them, is that I want to be sure that an artist is tied up for the least amount of time possible and will have the most control of their life possible. And so if they can get ownership, I don't like giving up ownership of songs, which has been, achievable for quite some time now. I don't like giving up ownership of masters, which is relatively recent, and you need some amount of bargaining power, but it's more doable today than it ever was in history. In management contracts, I don't like a long-term without the ability to get out if there's not success, because I've seen too many managers get their hooks in someone and then not let go unless they got paid for it, and it can really hurt their careers. So it's really more about just protecting the freedom and independence of the artist.
Yeah, very, very much so. And what's interesting in listening to you is how, you talked about how masters are, that's a very recent kind of development. Yeah. And I guess the question that comes to mind with regards to that, Don, is do you think that ownership of masters from a record company side has the same value, or that they have, is that why there's a willingness to let artists own this? Or is it because more and more today, from a technological standpoint, artists can make and finance their own masters before even going to a record company?
No, it's definitely not because the record companies don't value them. They do not like the idea that they don't own the masters. It's mostly because the artists have so much bargaining power now when they've got a lot of heat started on their own. And yes, it's because it's relatively cheap to create masters now. Artists are doing it on their own. And when they catch, lightning in a bottle and suddenly they're viral and there's massive heat on them, they can negotiate these kinds of deals.
Okay. Don, we want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us about the new 11th edition of your book. It's been very, very informative and informational. I really appreciate it. We both do, and we're very, very grateful to you.
It's absolutely my pleasure. You've been a great supporter of all you need to know about the music business for many years, and I appreciate that very much.
We appreciate you.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good evening.
You too, Don. Thanks again.
Thanks, Don.
Well, as always, that was an interesting conversation. Yeah. I love talking to Don. Number one, he is truly one of the most articulate people about this subject and these subjects that we talk about. And number two, he has written, what is considered to be the Bible of the business.
Yeah, and we were so excited to get him back on the show to discuss the new 11th edition and all the changes that, happened between the 10th and the 11th. And yeah, you're right. He has such a great way of speaking, and it translates in the book because he makes it so simple for everybody to kind of distill it down. And yeah, just very exciting.
Yes, that's an art. That's an art. And it's funny. It is something that I've heard him speak about. He knows that he has that gift, and it is a gift of taking very complex subjects and being able to express them in a way that everybody can understand. And in the music business, that's not an easy thing to do. You know, if you recall, you know, most of the books that were written before his were very, very dense, very, very complex, very
scientific in nature
and dry,
and
not inviting. He made it very, very
fun.
engaging,
engaging and fun.
And he's a bright and engaging man when you speak to him as well.
Yeah, one of the things that I loved about the conversation was about we've been talking about this subject throughout some of the episodes, but about the true value of music publishing and this whole idea of all the people recently, you know, we talked about Stevie Nicks and Paul Simon and Dylan and Springsteen, all of these older artists that are selling their publishing, even new artists that are selling their publishing. And I thought that was a very interesting, you know, take that he had on that and why you shouldn't be, you know, giving that away.
Absolutely. And you know the most interesting part about that? Number one, he talked about the true value of publishing, especially for new and even mid-level successful songwriters. But number two, he talked about the distinctions as to why perhaps a Bob Dylan or a Bruce Springsteen would sell all of their song rights, all of their record royalties, all of their record production royalties outright. Perhaps the family doesn't want to get involved in running. I mean, can you imagine being the children of Bob Dylan and running that catalog when he passes away? It would literally become your full-time job. Literally. And you'd have to hire people as well. So,
and I think it also has to do, like what you talk about a lot, the station of life that you're in.
Yes.
And these artists are already at the twilight of their career, and I think they're probably just, you know, cashing in their chips, like what you said, whether it's to pass it down to their family, so to avoid these problems, like what we discussed about the Prince issue that's currently going on again, where that's ramped up again, and we're having, you know, infighting going on with that. But I think it speaks to deeper, even talking about the new artists, because we've had new artists that are current, that are correct, that are in this, that have been giving that away. So it's just very interesting to hear his thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other aspect that I thought was most interesting was the AI discussion, because it literally came up in the middle of his writing the new edition and making the new points about the book. And I love the fact that he said, because it happens to be my own belief as well, where he spoke that he feels that AI will be a contribution. It will not be this.
It's going to be a tool.
It will not be this, you know, death and destruction and the end of humanity, and nothing will be created by real human beings anymore. It'll be a tool that can be used. And truthfully, Eric, I think, you know, you and I both know this. We're already seeing that. Yeah,
we definitely are. And I loved the idea that what he was saying, which, you know, everybody should know, that just because you created something or ran a prompt through ChatGPT or DALL-E or whatever your preferred language of choice is, that copyright is not yours, which I found it interesting. Now, will that be in the future? And that's what I think I asked him. We don't know. That's going to be really interesting to see how that evolves.
Yeah, absolutely. And his explanation about the MMA, you know, the Music Modernization Act, which really codified and updated and clarified a lot of record royalty payments, a lot of, you know, small, you know, publishing has become very, very complex, especially in the fact that, you know, songs aren't written by 1 and 2 people anymore. They're written by 5 or 6. You look at any hit song today, and it does have 5 or 6 people.
Or 25.
Or 25. Yeah, in some cases, I've seen 24 writers on a song. That's 24 writers, 24 publishers, etc. And how do you administer that? You know, this has become a very, very big issue, even within the royalty payment on Spotify. You know, we spoke about that, I think, recently, where Spotify is now, as of Monday, going to have a ruling where no song on Spotify, no recording, is going to be paid royalties unless it has 1,000 streams or more. And part of the reason for that is not greed, it's administrative costs with regards to space, money, time, energy, accounting, all of that.
Or it's the glut of music that's not getting even, you know, that nobody's even playing.
And they don't want to be responsible or accountable for having to financially be accountable for, what is it, something like a third of the music, or what is it, 40%? It was some staggering stuff.
Maybe so now they don't have to think about that anymore, and they could just focus on what is actually causing traffic.
And needing to be, accounted for. But, I only bring that up in relation to, the point that Don was making about the value of music publishing. It is something that lasts you your whole life. It is something that does have value. And the other fact that we talked about was, the idea of managing money. Like if you do sell your catalog, and the example I gave of the guy who had hits over the last 10 years, sold it, you also have to be very good with money because it's probably going to be the last money you will ever see in relation to your own songwriting career.
Correct.
So you better make it last. That sounds easy, but how many times have we heard, Eric, in our lifetimes, stories of people that have blown through tens of millions of dollars in very short periods of time? Forget music, even in the lottery system, where we've seen that. They're broke within 5
They have
6
shows
years.
about the lottery winners that have gone down terrible roads after they've won these massive amounts of money. Yeah, I do believe, too, that like what you said, it's very important because we are living longer. Longevity is happening longer with people. So you get these artists now that are in their 70s, 80s, and they may live another 20 years. And Don, I think, brought up the point, too. It depends on the artist too, because the person could be having money problems and they could be owing all kinds. And so that's like an infusion of cash that's coming in to pay off all that stuff. But what's left, they got to live on for the rest of their, lives. So it's a very interesting take on what's happening with that trend.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of the figures that you see, you have to realize, how much of that is going to be taken from taxes? How much does a manager get? How much does a business manager get? And then when you end up with the amount of money you do and you invest it, like Don said,
attorney's going to get too. Yeah.
Exactly. All of those percentages are paid off. It's kind of like a tour when you see, Taylor Swift is the first artist to make $1 billion on tour. That's what the tour grossed.
The gross, right.
But I would love to see what that tour actually cost her. How much of that
per day?
Yeah, or how much of that $1 billion had to be spent?
Correct.
In order to get it.
Was it
20%? Was it 30%? Was it probably at that scale? It was closer to 40%.
Right.
That
you and I have talked about that with you too, when it was costing them $1 million plus a day just to keep that show on. And it wasn't until like a year or so later that they were finally making a profit. They were losing money.
Yes, that's right. And the reason they had to continue the tour was because they were losing money, because it was so expensive. 750 people.
Right.
Do you know what that costs salary-wise and accommodations and semis
and they had multiple stages that were being forwarded to the next date. So I think they had 2 or 3 stages that were advanced. So that it's a massive operation, and I assume the Taylor Swift was in the same definitely in that same category.
Yes, absolutely. So this is an interesting point when you think about I'm going to be getting this amount of money for my publishing. $30 million. What does that actually mean?
Right.
Well, truthfully, by the time it's all said and done and you've paid everything down, it means maybe, you have to go closer to
10 million, 10 million.
Well, more like 50% of that.
Right.
If you're lucky. Yeah. If you have smart people, that's what you'll end up with. So 30 really means about 15.
Right.
That's what you'll end up with.
And I'm wondering if the artists are I'm sure they are factoring that into what am I going to take home from that after expenses,
Exactly. So a lot of great points, a lot of great info from Don. I always, think that he's an exciting, vibrant person to talk to who truly is on the cutting edge of all of these issues and continues to write about them.
Hey, Insiders, thanks so much for tuning into this episode. We really appreciate it. To get show notes, links, and everything that was mentioned during this interview, head on over to our official website at MUBUTV.com/podcast/show notes. If you're enjoying the content and what we're doing here on the show, please subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts from. And don't forget to rate and review our show at iTunes. 5-star reviews are always welcome and help to ensure that our podcast stands out on the top-rated and new and noteworthy charts on iTunes and our space. You can also find us at social media at Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter X, all ending with the handle MUBUTV, which is spelled MUBUTV. Don't forget to catch our flagship show, the MUBUTV Music Business Insider video series, airing every week on YouTube at youtube.com/MUBUTV. This show was produced and created by Ritch, Esra, and Eric Knight. Theme music by Disciples of Babylon, and be sure to tune in next week for another episode of the MUBUTV Music Business Insider Podcast.